We'll turn now to Sam Gindin. Leo's, of course, longtime friend, comrade, co-writer of The Making of Global Capitalism. One of the great pleasures I've had since moving to Toronto a few decades ago was to kind of get into be able to kind of get access to the weekly dialogue arguments between Sam and Leo and participate in them. Seeing them kind of going at each other's throat and participating. One of the most remarkable things about them is they kind of never have this argument about saying you were wrong in this state in the past. It's always as you've seen already, and Sam, of course, is going to go in that direction right now. There are kind of always arguments about what's our problem right now and how do we move ahead. It's been really a great fortune to participate in that dialogue. I welcome Sam's comments now.
Thanks, Rick. Thanks to the organizers. I'm still, my head is rolling with what Hal just said. There was an interesting moment just near when Leo was retiring. He had his class over for the last seminar, as he often does. That was a great discussion, and they left, and I sat through it. And after they left, Leo was sitting in the chair, leaning back. His lips were pursed. He was stroking his chin, as he often does. And the benign look on his face was actually expressing him seeing how much he actually loved teaching, and that he was actually good at it, and also that he was expelling from these students, and not because they were acolytes, but because he was seeing them developing into independent thinkers, and that was so exciting. Everyone here has been expressing what a privilege it was to be part of Leo's intellectual and social life, and I've probably been more privileged in this regard than anybody here. As a friend of Leo and Melanie's for well over half a century now, in writing together, in arguing together, and working things out together, in learning from Leo. When I worked in the union, before we were writing together, Leo constantly pressured me to be more audacious, and so did Greg. And that was incredibly important to me. It was fundamental to keeping me going, and the things they passed on to me to read, but not just keeping me going, but going in the right direction. When Leo raises the singular importance of overcoming the debilitating pessimism on the left, he's not only addressing others, he's especially trying to convince himself of the possibility of doing so. His emphasis on revolutionary optimism as the counter to pessimism isn't, I think it's important to emphasize, a matter of choosing another mindset, of replacing a pessimistic t-shirt with an optimistic one. Nor is it just a matter of ratcheting up optimism a few notches so it's more radical. What Leo's instead suggesting, I think, is that the saving grace of socialism is its contingency. That if it isn't inevitable, it at least depends. And what it depends on, as people have been repeating here, is the development of a collective agency to bring socialism into existence, an agency aided and abetted by the best and most clear-headed intellectual analysis of what we face. What is remarkable about this event is that this event brims with exactly that kind of Leo-influenced revolutionary optimism. It might seem strange to honor Leo in the way I'm about to, but what I want to pose here are some challenges to the very believability of the socialist vision. I obviously intend this not in any discredited spirit of pessimism, but as part of soberly reflecting on what we're up against. And I had to add that sentence because, as I've said before, whenever I leave to give a talk, my partner turns to me and asks, "Who are you going out to the press today?" We don't actually know whether socialism is possible. Believing in socialism means understanding that if we are to fulfill the individual and collective needs and potentials of humanity, only socialism might realize this. And being a socialist means striving for something radically better and living our lives as if socialism is possible. The Marxists have offered rich clues to what an eventual socialist society might institutionally look like. They, for the most part, they're reluctant to detail the kind of society our analysis of capitalism points to. In the manifesto, Marx and Engels praised the utopians for condemning capitalism, but criticized their subsequent focus on wishful thinking rather than willful action. They especially attacked the utopians' lack of an historical lens, seeing the utopians as both lagging and yet also prematurely racing ahead of history. Lagging in that they missed the significance of a newly emerging revolutionary actor, the proletariat, rashly racing ahead in building castles in the air that tried to detail a distant world that could at present only be conceived in the most general terms. There's clearly something to this. At that early stage of capitalism, the car, never mind the airplane, electronic, computer, and internet, had not yet been invented. Trade unions were just appearing, universal suffrage was still an epoch away, the modern state wasn't yet recognizable, and above all, the Russian Revolution hadn't yet burst into the political stage. To have then debated what socialism might look like certainly does in retrospect, confirm how presumptuous it would have been to devote much time or attention then to the workings of some future alternative. The actual paths of revolutions reinforced this stance. The Bolsheviks, overwhelmed by immediate pressures, ultimately spent little time working out the details of the new society, a pattern that wasn't unusual. Revolutionary struggles have generally revolved around immediate needs of bread, land, shelter, and freedom, not distant ideals. Moreover, with socialism in the air in the century following the manifesto, even if its revolutionary extent has often been exaggerated, it didn't seem that out of step to concentrate on how to get there, not the details of the vision itself. But that context has radically changed. Consider. In the last half of the 19th century, traditional cultural, religious, and family ties still blocked capitalism's full sway, and working class absorption into the new social system remained incomplete. Socialism was then widely discussed among workers, and in London it was, as one commentator noted, fashionable for even West End dinner parties to affect an interest in and knowledge of it. Mass socialist parties were emerging across Europe, and though a mass socialist party never took hold of the United States, anti-capitalist rumblings and an urge to overthrow the new order of things were common in the early years of the 20th century. And with the first half of the 20th century punctuated by two wars, the Russian Revolution and the Great Depression, notions of alternatives to capitalism persisted. But as the century rolled on, socialism was stymied by the profound defeat of the working class's agency, with unions today unable to even defend past gains, never mind moving on, as well as the collapse of socialist experiments, both large and small. Though the term socialism is still bandied about and has even had a revival, its revolutionary content has generally been eroded. Today, as Steve Fraser recently put it, hope in truly radical alternative, truly radical alternative, rings oddly in our ears. With revolutionary socialism so absent in popular consciousness, developing a much more systematic consideration of socialism's possible functioning, even if what we offer remains relatively general, incomplete, and even speculative, seems a critical condition for reviving a receptivity to concrete utopias and the willful action to achieve them. A reasonably convincing alternative is now elemental to encouraging social movements to press beyond protest, to sustain socialists who are wavering, to recruit the newly discontented, and to reintroduce the working class to a long-term project worth committing to. The challenge isn't to present anything like a blueprint of socialism. The usefulness and possibility of such fanciful detail is resolutely limited. The more modest yet still daunting aim is rather to indicate, with a measure of plausibility, how the intimidating obstacles to self-consciously constructing an entirely new world might be overcome. That is, the need is to establish among potential sympathizers who are as yet unconvinced a degree of confidence in the credibility of socialism. This today seems crucial to, as Ernst Bloch so poetically put it, to making the dead man walk the earth again. In that regard, I want to raise 10 points that will have to be discussed, debated, and eventually answered. First, we need to discard the mechanical notion of capitalism as the dialectical enabler of socialism, of doing much of the heavy lifting for us. Capitalist development is, of course, relevant as both an example of human possibilities and presenting certain openings. The new always gestates to some extent in the old, but neither the concentration of capital nor the capitalist development of planning through multinational corporations extending across firms, sectors, and regions, nor the stunning breakthroughs in computer capacity solve the complex riddle of how to manifest the society-wide collective ownership of the means of production without it being usurped by the state or fragmented into competing workplaces. Along the same vein, the emergence of a working class does not necessarily create independent dreams. Workers' daily experiences are at least as likely to distort their dreams and even push them towards the wrong dreams. Nor does capitalism spontaneously develop the kind of individual and collective working class capacities that might challenge capitalist power. It may instead systematically constrict and waste those capacities. That's, of course, one of the fundamental criticisms we make of capitalism. And where there are working class successes, the legal recognition of unions, winning the vote, rising individual consumption and collective services, these gains, as Brian Palmer pointed out yesterday, also played an integrative role rather than a stepping stone to deepening oppositional counterpower. Second, we need to similarly discard the glib bookends of the dictatorship of the proletariat and the withering away of the state. This isn't a matter of being Pollyannish about preserving the revolution, but rather of sensitivity, as Leo and I have written, to Rosa Luxemburg's point that in suppressing the bourgeois revolutions, this also risks limiting the freedoms and political development of the base and extending that limit into the future. Addressing this dilemma involves, from the very beginning, reinventing the state so it is actively developing popular democratic capacities as part of overcoming the sabotage of capital. And though the decentralization of the state is an essential corollary to taking worker control seriously, this will at the same time demand new functions for the state to mediate social property, deal with imbalances, guide the overall future direction of the economy, develop the democratic skills for real workplace and community participation. The great challenge, the defining element of the revolution lies, as Leo has always emphasized, not in the withering away of the state, but in its transformation so it can play a transformative role in society. Third, as absolutely vital, I emphasize absolutely vital, as praxis is, sustaining it cannot be taken for granted. Christian Rakovsky, a participant in the Russian Revolution and later a dissident who was internally exiled under Stalin, keenly noted the corrosion of the revolutionary spirit, not only as those who made the revolution passed on, but even among the committed who remain. I'm quoting him. The psychology of those who are charged with the diverse tasks of direction in the administration and the economy of the state has changed to such a point, he's saying this in 1928, has changed to such a point that not only objectively, but subjectively, not only materially, but also morally, they have ceased to be a part of the very same working class. This was true, he argued, in spite of a factory director being a communist, in spite of his proletarian origin, in spite of the fact that he was a factory worker a few years ago. Fundamental to socialism is the continuous opening up of space for further struggles, experiences, and learning, a constant praxis. Fourth, the vast complex of powers that these planners, ministry heads, and managers are part of provides the material base for the creation and reproduction of a social oligarchy with special privileges and powers. The checks of bourgeois democratic forms, as important as they are, elections of the overseers, transparency, civil rights to protest and debate, will not, I'm convinced, be enough to offset the tendency to the creation of such a social oligarchy. The socialist answer to this lies in worker control over workplaces, so that the confidence and power of those charged with directly implementing the plans are able to act as a check on bureaucracy. Which leads to the fifth point. The question arises of how to mesh the particular interests of groups of worker-controlled workplaces and the general interests as expressed in the plan. Developed socialist consciousness is essential here, but it's not enough. Workers autonomously making decisions about what materials to use and how long to work cannot responsibly make such trade-offs without mechanisms that can systematically weigh the alternatives. They can't know those alternatives just from their own workplace. Sixth, if such decentralization demands, as I controversially argue it does, a significant role for some kinds of markets and prices, including between production unions, then even if the context of different production relations gives them a different role, gives prices and markets a different role, we're still left with the question of whether the centrifugal impact of material incentives on competition, inequality, and consumerist culture can be avoided, or how, over time, it can be eased and ameliorated. Seventh, the socialist plan is a national plan, but this now involves more than socializing the national means of production. What's also necessary is the complex disentangling of the national from the international with its value chains and financial links, and as in Europe, even state interconnections via subsidies, in the case of Greece. Eighth, though Marx referred to the muck of ages in referencing popular consciousness, this today has a more literal meaning in terms of the accumulated environmental detriment any future socialist revolution will inherit, threatening to throw some goals off track and accelerating difficult cultural changes in others. Ninth, we must come to see socialism not as an imperfect phase on the way to a later perfected one, but a permanently imperfect one resting on experimentation, learning, and invention. That is, we must expect socialism to be an uncertain, uneven, contested, contradictory, and perhaps even reversible process. Finally, what about the post-revolution role of revolutionary parties? If the context of socialism is going to be the continuing uncertainty and contestation and even reversibility, then this raises question of direction of the revolution and its pace and the need for a party to influence this. The party that we're talking about here doesn't stand above society. It's enveloped in the same contradictions that I've raised above. And what the party must learn, if it's in governance, it has to deal with the problem that Michael has raised, which is how do you balance being a government of a state with all the immediate pressures and yet continue to educate, evangelize, and organize both inside and outside the state. And moreover, we have to recognize that this government, this party, can be unelected, and it's going to have to figure out how to regenerate its past authority through democratic contestation. Let me conclude. David Mandel, in an important new book on the Soviet Marxist dissident, Yakov Kronrad, who I don't think anybody has heard of, he wrote a book which was critical. He referred to it as his desk book because he knew it would never get out of his desk. Nobody would ever publish it. David interviews one of Kronrad's students about his mentor. The student describes how, by personal example and through his constant demands on both himself and his students, Kronrad pushed those around him to raise their expectations of himself. He made, as the student said, ashamed to remain small. This sentiment from another world seems a remarkably fit tribute to Leo as well.